The sun rose over the desert like a silent witness, spilling light across the endless rows of steel and dust. The base was awake, but only barely. Boots scuffed the gravel, engines hummed low, and conversations stayed cautious, clipped. It was the kind of place where rank weighed heavier than air itself, and silence was safer than truth. That was the world Lieutenant Mara Jennings walked into. A new intelligence officer. Unknown. Unassuming. To most, just another name stitched onto a uniform. But in less than 5 minutes, that name would ripple across the base like a rumor too loud to ignore. Now, before we show you exactly what happened next, hit that like button and tell us in the comments what country you're watching from, because this general will never underestimate anyone again. No one noticed her at first. She moved with quiet precision, eyes sharp but calm, the kind of presence that didn't demand attention. It absorbed it. A few soldiers looked up from their trays as she passed through the mess hall that morning, curious but uninterested. She nodded politely, sat alone, and unfolded a report she'd spent the night reviewing. Somewhere behind her, laughter echoed, a mix of arrogance and fear disguised as humor. It was the kind that told you who held the power here. Outside, the wind carried dust across the tarmac, blurring the flags and faces alike. Inside, something else was shifting, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. No one could have imagined what she would do next, or how quickly the fragile order of the base would fracture around her. But if you looked closely, you could already feel it, hidden beneath her composure, beneath the thin layer of sand that covered everything here, a quiet defiance, waiting for the right moment to breathe. The base was a world within walls, neat rows of barracks, cameras on every corner, and the sharp rhythm of boots striking pavement like the ticking of a clock that never stopped. Inside those gates, order was not a guideline, it was law. Every salute, every glance, every word spoken carried weight. It wasn't fear of war that haunted the soldiers here, it was fear of disobedience. They'd learned long ago that silence was the safest language to speak. At the center of that quiet dominion stood General Kellen Ward. To newcomers, he looked every bit the decorated leader, stern jaw, ironed uniform, medals that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. But to those who served beneath him, he was something else entirely, a storm wrapped in authority. His anger didn't just fill rooms, it rearranged them. A single word from him could send ripples through the chain of command. Soldiers called him the Wall, not because he was strong, but because nothing and no one could get through him. Mara watched it all unfold like an observer in a foreign land. Her job was intelligence analysis, but what she really studied was human behavior. She noticed how laughter stopped when Ward entered a room, how soldiers avoided eye contact, even with each other, how truth here was edited before it ever reached the page. That realization settled heavy in her chest. This wasn't just discipline, it was submission dressed as order. She carried her calmness like armor, not arrogance. There was something different about her stillness, as if her silence came from conviction, not fear. She didn't speak much, but her eyes did. They questioned things most people ignored. It wasn't rebellion. It was integrity searching for a place to belong. And though no one said it aloud, everyone could feel that sooner or later, the quiet lieutenant and the unshakable general were destined to collide. The debriefing room was cold, its air thick with formality and fatigue. Screens flickered with satellite imagery, reports scattered across the long metal table. General Ward stood at the head of it all, voice sharp and decisive, dictating the version of the mission that would make it to official record. His tone left no room for correction, no space for truth. Civilian structures were not affected, he declared flatly. Around the table, pins froze mid-note. Everyone knew that wasn't true, but in this room, the truth wasn't currency. It was contraband. Mara sat near the end, her uniform crisp, her hands steady. For a moment, she considered silence like everyone else. But something in her refused to bend. She raised her hand slightly, a small motion that felt enormous in that room. "Sir," she began softly. "With respect, that's inaccurate. The surveillance feed clearly shows collateral damage." Her voice didn't shake. It was calm, factual, too calm. The room seemed to stop breathing. Ward's head turned slowly toward her, his expression unreadable but his silence deafening. He stepped closer, each word measured and heavy. "Lieutenant, are you implying I'm mistaken?" She met his gaze without flinching. I'm saying the report should reflect what actually happened. The air thickened. A junior officer shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed just to fill the void. Ward's jaw tightened. Dismissed, he said, his voice low but dangerous. She stood, saluted sharply, and left without another word. By evening, the entire base was humming with whispers. In the mess hall, conversations halted as she walked in. Forks hovered midair. Some soldiers looked at her with quiet admiration, others with fear for what she'd just invited. Challenging a general wasn't bravery, it was suicide. Yet she moved as though she didn't notice the weight of the stairs. Outside, the night winds swept across the compound, carrying with them a question that no one dared ask aloud, but everyone felt pressing against their ribs. What would the general do to silence her? The next morning, the air inside the operations hall felt heavier than usual, charged with something electric and unseen. Officers lined the room in stiff silence, their faces composed but eyes restless. General Ward stood at the front, his presence alone enough to drain warmth from the air. "Lieutenant Jennings," he called, voice slicing through the hum of conversation. She stepped forward, posture straight, expression unreadable. Everyone already knew this wasn't a standard briefing. It was an execution of authority dressed as protocol. Ward began slowly, circling his words like a predator. "When I give an order," he said, "I expect obedience. Not hesitation. Not debate." He glanced at her, eyes sharp. "You question my command in front of my officers." His tone was calm on the surface, but it quivered with restrained rage underneath. Mara kept her gaze level, her hands folded neatly behind her back. "Sir," she replied evenly, "I stated facts from verified intelligence. There was no intent to undermine." Her composure seemed to enrage him further. His voice rose, the echo bouncing off concrete walls. "You think your rank gives you the right to challenge me?" She didn't flinch. "I think truth does, sir." The room fell silent. Her words hung there, delicate but unbreakable, the kind that couldn't be taken back. Then it happened. A blur of motion, a flash of anger unmasked. Ward stepped forward, his hand shooting out, fingers gripping a fistful of her hair. The sound of her chair scraping the floor echoed like a gunshot. Gasps rippled through the room. Time fractured. No one breathed. The fluorescent lights hummed too loudly. A metal cup toppled somewhere in the back. Mara didn't struggle. Her eyes lifted, calm, steady. "Sir," she said quietly, "release me." Her voice wasn't trembling. It was the sound of control wrapped in gentleness. The general's grip faltered for a split second, but pride held it firm. Around them, fear sealed every mouth shut. Not a single soldier moved. It was the kind of moment that stretches forever, when silence becomes witness, and everyone knows something irreversible has just begun. The silence in the room was so complete it seemed to hum. The general's knuckles were white, his grip a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked power. Mara's hair was twisted painfully in his hand, yet her expression didn't crack. Her breathing stayed even, eyes steady and deliberate. "Sir," she repeated softly, "release me." There was no plea in her tone, only command disguised as calm. It was the kind of composure that unsettles the powerful because it refuses to feed their anger. When he didn't move, her body shifted almost imperceptibly. A turn of the wrist, a pivot of the shoulder, precise, practiced. In one fluid motion, she broke his grip, stepping backward as his balance faltered. The maneuver wasn't violent, but it was absolute. Ward stumbled a half step, the shock plain on his face. The hand that once held control now hung in the air, empty and trembling. Every eye in the room followed it, as if witnessing gravity itself lose meaning. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint buzz of the lights overhead and the distant whir of the command cameras recording everything. Mara stood upright, her uniform immaculate, her calm unshaken. "Sir," she said clearly, her voice ringing across the room, "you've just violated Article 93 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Cruelty and maltreatment of a subordinate." Her words were scalpel-sharp, cutting through decades of hierarchy in a single sentence. Some officers blinked, unsure if they'd actually heard her say it aloud. Others looked down, their faces pale. For the first time in his career, General Ward seemed smaller than the room he ruled. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. The authority that once filled every corner of the base was now shrinking around him. collapsing into silence. Mara didn't move toward him or away. She simply stood there, grounded, hands at her sides. It wasn't defiance. It was truth refusing to retreat.
What did you do?
And in that
What
stillness,
did you do?
something unspoken shifted. The soldiers who'd once feared him now saw him as he was. Just a man,
What did you do?
flawed,
What
caught
did
in
you
his
do?
own pride. She didn't need to say another word. The room, the witnesses, the camera, they said it for her. Power had changed hands, not through force, but through grace. By the next morning, the story had already outgrown the room it happened in. Whispers traveled faster than radio signals, threading through corridors and barracks, retold in fragments of disbelief. Some said she'd struck him down, others swore she hadn't even raised her voice. What none of them disagreed on was the look on the general's face, the shock, the loss of command in his eyes. Within hours, the footage from the command cameras found its way to higher offices. What was once private humiliation became official evidence. Investigators arrived before sunrise, a convoy of quiet authority. They didn't ask much at first, just replayed the footage again and again, their expressions unmoved. General Ward's uniform remained crisp, but his voice had lost its weight. He was suspended pending review, his title stripped from the air like paint from metal. For the first time, people spoke freely in his absence. Conversations turned from fear to reflection. It wasn't celebration, it was release. The air itself felt lighter. Mara answered questions with calm precision. No embellishment, no emotion, just facts. He grabbed me. I asked him to stop. I acted within training protocol. That was all she said. She didn't claim victory, didn't posture as a hero. When others tried to praise her, she simply nodded and returned to her duties. But around her, something intangible had shifted. Soldiers who once avoided eye contact now stood a little straighter. Officers spoke with measured fairness. Her quiet integrity became a legend in real time, retold in low voices across the mess hall and the firing range alike. Weeks later, she was called to headquarters. The decision was final. General Ward was relieved of command. Mara received an official commendation and a promotion to oversee ethics and leadership training for new recruits. When she walked back through the same halls, people rose, not by rule, but by respect. The salute she returned was brief, humble. She hadn't set out to make history. She had only refused to surrender what was right. And somehow, that had changed everything. In the end, the story of what happened that morning stopped being about rank, rules, or even revenge. It became a quiet parable whispered through generations of recruits. A reminder that true courage doesn't always storm the gates or shout to be heard. Sometimes, it's the steady voice that refuses to yield when silence would be safer. The general's name, once spoken with intimidation, drifted into obscurity, a cautionary echo of what power without principle becomes. But Mara's name lived on, not as legend or myth, but as a lesson. They said new cadets still hear her story on their first day, not as a warning, but as an anchor. Integrity before comfort, the instructors remind them. Courage before compliance. Her act of quiet defiance became the pulse of a new standard, proof that strength isn't measured by volume, but by conviction. And as the narrator's voice softens to a close, it feels less like a story and more like a hand resting on your shoulder. If this story reminded you that honor still matters, share it, because someone, somewhere, needs to hear it today.